Welcome to Spotlight. The UK has been witnessing rolling strikes for some time now over pay disputes and working conditions as the country grapples with rising inflation and a cost of living crisis. And now border force staff, that is at airports, have joined the nationwide walkouts, prompting warnings of delay for air travelers. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has struck a combative tone, saying that he has acted fairly and reasonably over public sector pay. In this edition of Spotlight, we'll discuss the root causes of the growing public dissatisfaction in the UK and its repercussions and the government's response to it. Joining us on this edition of Spotlight, we have activist and commentator Mick Napier, joining us from Edinburgh. We also have political and economic analyst Shebi Rizvi, who's joining us from the British capital, London. Well, gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Napier in Edinburgh. British workers in various sectors have been staging back-to-back walkouts since the summer, and now passport control staff go on strike ahead of Christmas. Help us better understand the impact that these major walkouts will have.
Well, the claims tonight from the employers were that astonishingly, that the passport workers' walkout had very little impact on travel. But one also hears complaints from business people that the postal strikes are having a very significant impact on their ability to do business, that customers are not getting what they've paid for. I mean, given the vast penetration of the internet into much of business in Britain over the last few decades, failure to deliver things, packages, the actual things that people buy on the internet, means that these workers have a very considerable impact when they withdraw their labour. And people are beginning to feel that now. So individuals feel it running up to Christmas, but that's inconvenient. But businesses are feeling it. And many can expect to hit a very serious crisis of their own because of the withdrawal of these workers' labour. And that's also exacerbated by the rail strikes, because rails don't just carry passengers, they carry a lot of goods in this country. So yeah, it is having a very serious impact.
Shebi Rizvi, Britain is enduring a wave of industrial actions this winter triggered by inflation and surging energy prices. The industrial action by aviation workers is due to last until New Year, but the strikes by the border force staff at UK airports, in fact, could go on for months unless the government enters talks over pay. According to the PCS union, the government's 2% raise offer doesn't keep pace with the double-digit inflation in the country, and the government has so far refused to discuss pay, saying that it can't afford to pay more than a small increase. So if that's the case, then the walkouts will continue to persist across the country, won't they?
Hello, good evening. Well, look, first we've got to understand what we are talking about, the cost of living crisis that everyone keeps on referring to. It refers to the fall in real disposable incomes. That is, technically what is called adjusted for inflation and after taxes and benefits that the UK has experienced since late 2021. It is being caused predominantly by high inflation, outstripping wages, benefit increases, rate increases by all this terms obviously is the salary reduced, whether the government 5%, it's with earlier living crisis, the pocket.
All right, it seems that we're experiencing some technical difficulties with the connection there with Mr. Rizvi. I'm going to allow my colleagues to figure that out. We're going to address that a question to Mr. Napier as well, talking about how these walkouts will continue to persist across the country. And apart from that, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says that he believes he's acted fairly and reasonably over public sector pay. The strikers' demands, Mr. Napier, are not too outrageous. It's in line with the double-digit inflation. But the government is staying put on the single-digit increase. Why won't the government offer something that makes more sense?
Well, they have other priorities. Given that much of the inflation, as our other guest was beginning to say before I couldn't hear really what he had fully to say, but as our other guest initially said, much of this inflation is imported. The rise in the price of energy because of the war between Russia and NATO and Ukraine, that we see this feeding right across the entire economy. Basic foodstuffs beginning to rise, continuing to rise. Inflation was measured for the less well off with basic foodstuffs at 14 point something %. So the government is determined not to match this because they feel they have to mollify, they have to pacify bond dealers. After the catastrophic few weeks of the previous government of Liz Truss, really behaving stupidly in basic investor terms, and proving that the Tories simply are incompetent at the basic running of the economy. The current government feels they have to repair that damage to the tune of 30-40 billion in order to prevent the cost of borrowing money in the future by governments rising. So that's why Sunak is facing down these workers who are going on strike. He's refusing to budge. His language is absolutely devoid of negotiation or conciliation. He's essentially saying, in very few words, he's certainly not a rhetorician. He's saying, take it or leave it, and we are not going to budge. Now, that's a very dangerous situation for a government to take in this crisis, because if I were a gambling person, and I'm not, the one thing I would bet on is that these strikes will continue, because it's not really to do with just public opinion, which is refusing to move in the direction that the government wants and be critical of the strikers because of inconvenience. It's refusing to move in that direction. But it isn't just that. It's that there is no way ordinary workers can avoid a very substantial cut in their living standards. Some experts say that the most significant fall in living standards since records were kept, other than to struggle through strike action in order to defend themselves, because the alternative which there has been in the past of a Labour government promising to do something on behalf of working class people, that seems now to be absent. And Sir Keir Starmer has pushed the Labour Party so far to the right that workers are now beginning to think that there is no electoral alternative on the horizon, and that they have to take action themselves. So I think, yes, these strikes will continue well into the new year. Most recent statements by the Civil Service Union are saying that they have already built up a very substantial strike fund. They say they can continue their strikes for many months. The railway worker leaders have been saying the same thing. These strikes will continue. And when you reduce the commentary to its basics, it's because they have no choice but other than to accept a very, very substantial and very quick fall in their standards of living. Because if inflation is currently at 14%, there are no signs of it falling. I haven't read expert predictions that say that it will fall. And so the government, faced with imported inflation, which it cannot deal with, has selected the only target that it can, which is organised labour. But that means there's no way out.
Sure.
These strikes will continue for a very long period of time until one side wins or loses.
Mr. Sherry Rizvi is back with us now from the British capital, London. Mr. Rizvi, I'd like you to pick up where you left off about the persistence of these walkouts. Also, if you may, Britain's economy, as we know, is shrinking. Many would say it's already deep in a recession. GDP has dropped and inflation has hit record highs. What do you see as the underlying causes for the UK's troubled economic state at the moment?
Well, it's multiple factors. To start with, the Tory party has been in power for the last 12 years. And really, austerity measures, which has been applied very aggressively, has had an impact as I have previously sort of pointed out, let's take just the nurses, for instance. Their income has been reduced by £4,000 in the last 12 years, with sort of very little increases in their pay package of 1%, 2% over the last few years. So the buying power of what they have is significantly reduced. But really, on a more broader level, the effect of Brexit, the fallout from pandemic, rising inflation, exponentially high house prices, eye-watering increases in energy bills, and the big tax sort of increases in Britain's pay package from April of this year have all combined to put the pressure on the household finances. And on top of that, we are told that inflation is 12%, 13%, or whatever. But the reality is that a recent survey done by one of the British economic think tank shows very clearly that the cheapest items that people buy, the 10 cheapest, if you like, for instance, pasta and bread and eggs, they have actually gone up by 50, 60, in some cases 100% increases in the last year or so. So the reality is that whatever inflation figures we are being told is not really reflecting what people are feeling when they go out and buy their daily sort of food. On top of that, the government has the audacity, the government has the cheek, really, to say that they have no money. We've heard that previously from Theresa May when she said there's no money tree. But when things are required to be done, for instance, funding the war in Ukraine, billions are being pumped there, whilst ordinary people here are suffering with high energy bills, cost of living, and all other factors that I have just related to you.
Sure. Mr. Napier, a healthcare lobby group has in the past said the physical and mental health of low-income Britons could take a hard hit by soaring energy bills amid a looming humanitarian crisis. NHS Confederation says many Britons this winter could face, quote, the awful choice between eating and heating. How worried should an average British citizen be right now with this outlook?
They are already extremely worried. I mean, the figures for hunger, actual raw hunger among working class people, the poorest working class people over the last few years, are absolutely astonishing. Millions of children go to bed hungry every night. Millions of families in this country, one of the richest countries in the world, have to choose between heating and eating. And the cost of heating now is such that people are the quality of life for many people is already falling very, very substantially. People are living in homes that they are afraid to heat. If they have 3 rooms in their home, they are retreating into one and trying to heat one room. One guy interviewed on the national radio a few days ago said he heats his water for 2 hours a day, because it costs £2 an hour to do that, and that's all that he can afford. So there is a real, it's not a fear, there's a real understanding among many millions of people that life has become increasingly harsh. And at the same time, we are not in this together. All the figures show, I think, record inequality in this country. That during the pandemic, during a war, of course, there are always people who benefit. That a minority of people, the 1% is the way many people talk about it, have done extremely well, while the great majority actually suffer. So one thing which is coming up for this government, I mean, I've retired from full-time work myself because of age, is that benefits generally for unemployed people and retired people, people in real need, are expected to rise in line with inflation. Now the government is talking already about reneging on this and raising these benefits, which millions of people rely on, only by a lower figure, rise in income rather than inflation. So if that happens, that's another major attack on the living standards of many millions of poor people. So there's no escape. It isn't so much what workers think, it's that their lives are, the government policy now is very clearly to drive down their living standards. And that's not the language of radicals on the political fringes, it's the language of basic economic and political discussion. And for the first time, at the risk of repeating myself, this inflation is clearly substantially imported. The majority of people may not be trained economists like our other guests, but one thing they do know is that they did not cause the inflation. How could they cause the inflation when it runs alongside a substantial fall in their living standards? So given the government digging in and offering nothing other than this is what's going to happen, and given the nurses going on strike, for example, for the first time in British history, I would put my money on the nurses. I think if it's Rishi Sunak, a Tory Prime Minister, versus the nurses for British public opinion, and that public opinion in the end will be very important, because a failure to whip up the public against strikers is a real failure for a Conservative government. Then I think this crisis will run for a very considerable time.
Shebly Rezvi, throughout all the difficulties that Britons are facing, from the cost of living crisis to the stagflation and etc., the Labour Party has been criticizing the Tories, saying that this is a result of 12 years of mismanagement of their government. Do you believe the Tory leadership is to blame, at least for failing to prepare for this day?
Well, there's no doubt that Tories or their coalition partners in the early part of the Conservative government have been in power. Therefore, they can't blame it on the previous Labour government, which they have a tendency to do. And on top of that, what they have done, as I said, that austerity measures have been applied so aggressively. All the fiscal instruments that were available to the Bank of England have been used over the last 12 years. There isn't much in the armory of the economic planners and the sort of authorities who are responsible for what we are facing today. What really needs to happen is that, as our learned colleague from Scotland was saying, that there has to be a change in policy. And the change in policy is that, you know, the 1% real super wealthy rich people and the corporations that do not pay taxes in the UK, they've been often muted that the energy companies should be sort of levied with a windfall tax. How much that will going to bring in, that's also open to question. The other thing is that, you know, railways, for instance, the post office in UK were national industries not too long ago, which were privatized. And we were told that privatization will sort of make it more competitive, the consumers will benefit from it. But what has happened is that the top echelons of these privatized companies are milking millions out of it, whilst not willing to pay the ordinary workers what they properly deserve. So there's got to be a radical shift in economic policy, which really does not pander to the wealthy in United Kingdom. And at the end of the day, if the ordinary people cannot keep pace with the inflation, as I said, you know, the government says that it's 12%, but perhaps it's 20% and above. So what people are earning and are not able to keep pace with the inflation will have an impact on how they go about. But the other sort of interesting aspect is that the Bank of England has also increased the base rate to 3.5% only a few days ago. What that means is that mortgages which were available at, let's say, 2% only 6 months ago, now people have to pay 7% for mortgages.
Ms.
That
Rezvi,
has also on their ability to buy a home.
I'm going to jump in there with one quick question for you. How do you see the chances of this public dissatisfaction with the quality of life probably snowballing into something bigger?
Who's the question aimed at?
No, that was for Mr. Rezvi, and we have a last question from Mr. Napier as well.
But look, you know, when in foreign countries, overseas countries, prices get hiked like this, then we have demonstrations all over the world, which sort of demand that the government resign. I hope the people in UK have the courage and the strength to stand up to a government which has really made them poorer and poorer over the last 12 years.
Okay. We're running short of time, Mr. Napier. I'm going to ask you to be very brief, if you may. We can't look at Britain's economic situation now without mentioning the B word, Brexit, and its disruptions in trade. Is the UK now feeling the ripple effects of leaving the Union?
Yes, I hope that's brief enough. But I would also add that there is an option for the government to reduce inflation, and that is to negotiate peace with the Russians over Ukraine, because the inflation which is caused by that war is feeding into British homes. One final point I would make. In 1945, the British government owed vastly more as a percentage of GDP than it does now. But we saw the beginnings of the health service, of pensions, and of a fantastic increase in living standards and benefits for working class people. When the government says we can't afford it, there's no money, people don't believe it. There's plenty of money. They could tax the rich, but they refuse to do so. And failure to do so is a choice by the government to attack working class living standards, and they may yet live to regret it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Activist and commentator Mick Napier joining us from Edinburgh, and political and economic analyst Shabir Rizvi joining us from the British capital, London. And a special thanks to your viewers for staying with us on tonight's Spotlight. It's good night for now, and see you next time.